Ukraine has ordered a 40-day sprint to bring Russia to its knees and hopefully the negotiating table as President Zelensky threatens Belarus. And France says America is back on Ukraine's side after a year and a half of what looked to many like the White House was siding with Moscow. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're starting with President Zelensky's instructions to the SBU intelligence service, where he has authorised what he called a 40-day operation to influence the aggressor. Now, this has been translated somewhere as an influence operation, but fundamentally it is trying, he says, to change Moscow's point of view, to make them serious about peace. And it comes just hours after Russian cable-laying ships and air defense batteries in Crimea were struck by that SBU intelligence service, and they are claiming those operations are part of this influence operation. And those strikes indeed came just after a railway line at the top of Crimea was hit, after a ferry over Kerch was hit, and indeed a few days after a factory, a semiconductor plant in Voronezh was struck, we understand, with Scalp or Storm Shadow bunker-busting cruise missiles. Those are some of the most powerful, exquisite weapons in Ukraine's arsenal, donated by the United Kingdom and France. And I mention that operation specifically against the plant in Voronezh because in a talk this week in London, the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of Europe highlighted it as significant because he was talking about how important the industrial base of any nation is to its military might. And we've talked a lot on Frontline about the effort Ukraine goes to degrading Russia's oil infrastructure to try and hammer the Kremlin's coffers so that Moscow can't fund its war effort. But equally important, if not potentially more important, is degrading the industrial base so that Russia cannot make the machines and the weapons that its soldiers need to fight. Now, back to this 40-day operation. I wanted to have a look at perhaps the significance of 40 days, whether that number is important. President Zelensky announced it on the 25th of June, so 40 days later would bring us to the 4th of August. I just had a quick look to see whether that's a significant date in Russian or Ukrainian history. The only date I could come up with immediately was the day that former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev left to go on holiday in 1991, where he went to his dacha in Crimea, which was the beginning of the coup, an attempted coup by a Gang of Eight, which didn't succeed, but ultimately did lead to Gorbachev leaving power. And that in turn led to the collapse or was coinciding with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Also on the 2nd of August, important for Russia, it's Airborne Forces Day, where the VDV, Russian paratroopers, are celebrated. It's the anniversary of their founding. And last year, President Putin paid homage to them as the legendary winged infantry. These dates might be significant. I think more importantly, it's going to take us through a number of events, including an upcoming NATO summit in Ankara and indeed the 4th of July, where America will not only celebrate its Independence Day, but the 250th anniversary of its independence. I think most likely what President Zelensky is doing by announcing this 40-day push is effectively he's setting the narrative for what could be a Ukrainian escalation, hitting new, bigger, more important targets or simply a greater volume of targets. But he's setting the context that any strike like that is fundamentally designed to bring Russia to the negotiating table, to influence the aggressor, to change the mind of President Putin and those closest to him, to make them realize that they must sue for peace. Because for all the rhetoric we've seen over the 4+ years of this conflict, Russian claims to want to end the war have consistently proven hollow. Now, this comes in the context of two other attempts to shape the narrative, or at least to lay the groundwork perhaps for escalations. One is President Zelensky's threats to Belarus. He gave Belarus an ultimatum, which was to stop assisting Russian drone strikes on Ukraine. Relay stations, radio relay stations, are rebroadcasting commands between Russian forces and the Shahed drones and other drones which are being used to hit Ukraine, specifically hitting the rail supply lines that run from western Ukraine, bordering countries like Poland, eastwards to cities like Kyiv and the front lines further east. President Zelensky said that they would attack those relay stations. He said that he'd authorized an attack earlier this year. He would authorize another one. And he has since said that Belarus has switched them off. They're not working. They've been taken out of action. So that's de-escalated slightly. But after a meeting with his foreign intelligence chief in Kyiv this week, he has raised concerns about other infrastructure projects in Belarus, which he believes are to support Russia's war effort. Specifically, that's the building of roads near the border and ammunition dumps. So all potentially laying the groundwork for Russia to use Belarus as a launch pad for an invasion. Of course, you'll remember that back in February 2022, that is exactly what Russia did. There's also been quite a lot of chatter about an amphibious assault on Crimea. And in fact, one of your questions was asking whether Ukraine might use robots to launch such an assault. It's a really interesting idea, because why not? If you can reach the coast with drones, then surely you can deliver drones with either drone boats or with aerial drones delivering more drones onto the ground, motherships delivering drones into battle. It's possible. It's highly speculative. But the chatter in itself, just talking about an amphibious assault, whether or not it's likely, is perhaps part of a mind game designed to drive up anxiety for those people still in Crimea and for the military planners in Moscow, because of the risk that something like this might happen. Because even if it's remote, if there's this chatter about it, this public talk, and they do nothing about it, then they're more culpable if and when something does happen. And of course, we've also seen this week reports of a Ukrainian flag being raised on the Kinburn Spit. That's not in Crimea, but it's not far from Crimea. And unconfirmed reports that Russian forces there have had to withdraw. So all of this raising the stakes, raising the temperature and the pressure on Moscow over defending these parts of the occupied territories. President Zelensky reported that their intelligence services have got Russian documents which appear to show or reflect Russian public sentiment. Now, that's something that's very hard for us to gauge. And so for this, I have to be clear, we're relying on something that Zelensky has said that his intelligence services provided, that he claims reflects Russian public opinion. But of course, there are many, many filters there that risk the reliability of these figures. But nonetheless, he said that the anxiety amongst the Russian population is higher now, 50% higher now than it was during the Ukrainian assault on Kursk. That's when Ukrainian forces captured sovereign Russian territory to try and deliver a sense of jeopardy, to try and change the balance of the conflict. Also, Zelensky claiming that 66% of Russians are experiencing financial hardship and 80% believe that a financial crisis is inevitable. All of that would suggest that the efforts Ukraine is making to bring the war home, to hit Russian oil and gas infrastructure, to hurt the economy, and indeed to degrade the military-industrial complex is having an effect. People are noticing. But of course, we have not verified that for ourselves. We're not in Moscow. We're not speaking freely to ordinary Russians. So I report it with those caveats. Crimea remains really important. It remains a focus of Ukraine's efforts at the moment. I've talked about them tightening their grip. Perhaps they're also, another way of thinking of it might be softening up Crimea. Special Operations Forces, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, have over the last week hit a railway bridge over the canal, the North Crimea Canal. There have been more strikes on air defences, Pantsir anti-air defences, radars, fuel depots and logistics bases have all been hit. There was an oil terminal in Kerch, that's the eastern end of Crimea, where the Kerch Bridge connects occupied Crimea to mainland Russian. More radars, and indeed the ferry Panagia was reportedly struck. And just overnight, where I started this update, reports that 2 military support vessels, 2 naval support vessels have been hit in dock. And these are vehicles that can help lay acoustic sensors, acoustic arrays and mines. So they might be involved in defending the peninsula once they came into service, or once they were at sea, may have been involved in helping to defend the bridge. So all of that increasing the jeopardy for Crimea. One of you, though, asked a very good question. I will come to more questions at the end, but one of you, while we're on Crimea, asked a question about why would Ukraine want to invade Crimea? Because it's logistically at the moment such a nightmare to supply and to defend that it's become a noose around Russia's neck. And that's also a very interesting way of thinking about what Crimea is now and whether or not Ukraine really wants to capture it, or whether it's better for Ukraine simply to hold it at risk. Of course, it's a two-way street. Over the course of the last week, Russia has fired 820 missiles and drones, according to Ukraine's Air Force. That is a low figure, and whenever there is a low figure, it makes me nervous that there are going to be significantly big strikes coming. That's what we normally see. Moscow marshals its weapons. It decreases the number it fires in order to stockpile them, in order to unleash them in 1 or 2 or 3 nights of massive attacks, and those massive attacks increase the likelihood of overwhelming Ukraine's air defenses. Just last night, there are at least 6 people injured in a strike on Zaporizhia. Russia has also hit in the last week the Kremenchuk power plant. So Russia also hitting and continuing to hit Ukraine's energy infrastructure. In Konstantinivkya, in the close battle, reports that that Russian forces are continuing to claw their way through that city at the southern end of the fortress belt. But the city is very much far from fallen. There are also reports, though, that Russian forces are advancing to the west of the city, and that increases the jeopardy for those troops. I'm using that word jeopardy a lot today, but that is what's at stake, forcing military commanders to make decisions about where they are most at risk. Interestingly, President Putin said on June the 23rd that he will only negotiate, he's only prepared to negotiate with Ukraine on the basis of the peace deal that he says was presented in Alaska. You remember when Donald Trump rolled out the red carpet and the leaders had a summit in Alaska. This should be seen in the context of what both Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said recently, and indeed what French President Emmanuel Macron has said. So Rubio denied reports that there was a peace deal agreed in Alaska. He said there was a proposal, but it was never agreed. Russian officials trying to suggest that there was a deal on the table there, and that's what they want to go back to. Emmanuel Macron at a summit with a Franco-Italian summit in Antibes in the south of France, saying that America is no longer a neutral mediator, that actually is on the side of France and European allies who are supporting Ukraine defend its sovereignty. And he said that was a shift that happened at the G7 summit recently. That's good news if it's true. I think we've seen that the White House can be very mercurial over the last 18 months, and certainly actions speak louder than words. But Ukraine appears to have the upper hand at the moment, and we know that Donald Trump likes to back a winner. We wait to see what happens when NATO leaders gather in Ankara. We've seen from Pete Hegseth recently at a defense ministers' summit, continuing criticism of NATO allies for not spending enough. We're likely to hear some more of that, I would expect, from President Trump, but also Ukraine will be very, very high on the agenda. Outside the conflict, Russia and Romania have had tit-for-tat expulsions of each other's consulates. Well, there was a bit of a gap. Russia has closed a Romanian consulate in St. Petersburg. This is after Romania closed a Russian consulate in Constanta in May. The Romanians took that action because of a Russian drone that crashed into an apartment building in the east of their country. That was a drone involved in a strike on Ukraine. As ever, if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below. I try to answer as many as I can. I tried to get through all of them last week. We had over 2,000 comments. That's fantastic. It's really heartening to see that. And I've said before, a lot of them make me laugh. A lot of them make me think. And we do try to read and reply to as many as we can. The first question today: who would replace Vladimir Putin, and how does he leave the Kremlin? I'll answer the second bit first. I had a quick run through of the history books. Of the 9 leaders, not including Dmitry Medvedev, but of the 9 leaders since the Bolshevik Revolution, 4 have left office alive and 5 have died in the Kremlin or whilst they were still in power. That's Lenin, Stalin, Brezhnev, Andropov and Chernenko. Of those 4 who survived, 2, Gorbachev and Yeltsin, were both effectively pushed out by a coup or soon after a coup attempt. Vladimir Putin has a very, very tight grip on power. He is getting older. He appears to have survived or lived through whatever health worries there were, but the pressure clearly on him is ratcheting up because this war is not going to plan. I've had conversations with people who study the Kremlin incredibly closely and asked them exactly this question. I remember, surprisingly, 2 people in the security establishment at the tops of their organizations having very different perspectives on this. One suggesting that President Putin's fortunes are so closely tied to the war in Ukraine that if the war fails, he fails, whatever that means, but another suggesting that his control over the media and the narrative in Russia is so tight that effectively he could find a way to explain away his defeat in Ukraine and remain in office. Part 2 of the question is who succeeds him. $1 million question. I think this is something that Western intelligence services will study with huge intensity. There are a lot of names that continue to crop up. Mikhail Mishustin is the de facto, he would become the interim president. He is the prime minister. Under the Russian constitution, he would take over. Other names that continue to crop up: Alexei Dumin, he's the head of the Security Council. Nikolai Patrushev, he was the head of the FSB and known to be a sort of close confidant of Putin. And also among a cabal of names, we see Sergei Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow, as a contender. It's very hard to tell with any certainty who would take over or indeed how Putin leaves office. Question number 2. Would Ukraine consider doing leaflet drops over Moscow to try and, perhaps as part of this influence operation, but to try and change people's perspectives or thoughts on the war? It's a really good question. I remember when I was covering the war in Afghanistan with British forces in Helmand, they were doing exactly that. They were dropping leaflets. I remember also tragic examples of how dropping leaflets, when the carton failed to open and the leaflets didn't flutter down, it just dropped as a large cardboard box. It effectively acted as a bomb and killed a civilian by mistake. It's an interesting question because changing people's minds is really important. Whether Ukraine's considered it, almost certainly. They haven't carried it out as far as we know. The reason is probably this: if they're going to go to the effort of getting a drone all the way to Moscow, having cleared an air defense channel, having suppressed electronic warfare and jammers, then there are probably more valuable military tasks that drone can do, most notably hitting a factory or an oil refinery, than dropping leaflets. And the reason is they can try and change people's points of view, both with those military strikes, but also through the digital social feeds that everybody around the world these days relies on for information. So there are other ways of influencing people other than leaflets. The next question: when will Ukraine hit the Kremlin? This was asked as, when will we see flames over the Kremlin? And I'm going to blend it with one more question, which is, what would it take for Russia to use tactical nukes? Ukraine has hit the Kremlin. They hit the Kremlin quite early on in the conflict with very small drones that punctured the roof of one of the buildings, but they haven't targeted it with the same sorts of high explosive, large payload weapons that they've used to hit refineries and ports. That's probably because, in the same way that Russia has not targeted the Ukrainian parliament, hasn't hit Zelensky's presidential palace, whilst you could argue, you could make a case that these are targets with legitimate military targets, you can make that case, you can argue it both ways. Fundamentally, destroying the Kremlin, if the Kremlin was up in flames, that would clearly create a precedent, a justification for significant Russian escalation. It might create the excuse that Moscow wants to use weapons that it hasn't used before. I'm not suggesting that that would necessarily be tactical nukes, but under Russian doctrine, Russia explains or justifies the use of nuclear weapons when the state or the motherland is under threat. And so for as long as Ukraine is targeting or is trying to liberate its own territory rather than conquer Russia or destroy the Russian government, then I think it's harder for Moscow, despite being able to manufacture excuses for what it wants to do, it's harder for Russia to use nuclear weapons. And we know they did consider, they came very close to using nukes in the first October of the war, led to a frantic flurry of diplomatic activity. Britain's Defence Secretary shuttled over to Washington, raised the alarm in Washington. Washington raised the alarm in India and China and used the leverage that those countries have, India and China, used their leverage on Moscow to make very clear that nuclear conflagration is absolutely not to be considered or tolerated. As ever, thank you very much for watching. If you do have any questions, please ask them in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe The Sun. And if you want to follow more of my work covering defence in the UK and in Ukraine, then of course, do look me out on Twitter at Jerome Starkey and Instagram at Jerome Starkey as well.